Yeah, it's just a really simple calculus that, inside every server in a data center, at the heart of it, you have an NVIDIA GPU, right? That's the story we've known really well. And around the outside of that GPU, you have a proportionate number of corresponding high bandwidth memory chips, either 8 or 16 configuration. So looking at the forecast for the current period and the commentary from Micron CEO Sanjay Mehrotra, it's very simple that their product is in demand in that context. And to some extent, they're also a little bit supply constrained in that it's really expensive to build the capacity to manufacture high bandwidth memory chips. And you go from there. I think, there was high expectation that would be the case for Micron. Other areas, the legacy areas of the memory market are not as strong for them. But AI everything all the time, right? That's the story investors love.
Hey, Jake, we want to bring you in. Jake Silverman, Bloomberg Intelligence semiconductors analyst. I mean, how much of what we're seeing is, like Ed says, increased demand for what they do, and that means that they can even charge more? Is it a case of actual demand, more components, or higher prices, or a combination of both?
Yeah, it's definitely a combination. I mean, the most important thing for Micron, even with the demand that we're seeing for high bandwidth memory, still at the end of the day, the underlying demand for their traditional businesses, which is consumer oriented, traditional servers, anything like that, that's really going to be the major demand driver. And that really is driven by both supply and demand. It's a somewhat commodity-like market, so we have to see strong demand for bits, for DRAM and NAND, but then that also, depending on the amount of supply, drives pricing up or down.
Is it cyclical, Jake?
Yeah, I mean, it's still cyclical. The business, I mean...
Then where would you describe where we are in the cycle based on not just this print, but what we've heard from peers?
Yeah, it's interesting because these cycles tend to last anywhere from 4 to 7 quarters. I'd say 6 to 7 is kind of the average. Mm-hmm. So maybe, 4 to 9 quarters roughly. So, but the fact is that we kind of saw a mid-cycle lull just a couple of quarters ago. So now it's kind of a question mark of whether or not we're going to see, sort of another upcycle where we see another 7 quarters of continued growth, maybe early next year, a little bit of softness based on seasonality. But, that's a big question mark. And, high bandwidth memory, does that somewhat dampen the downside of the cycle? That remains to be seen. And we still need to see what the pricing dynamics look like. If Samsung's able to come to the market successfully next year, what that does to demand overall, to pricing. So there's a couple of different factors to look at.
Hey, Ed Ludlow, come on back in here.
Sure.
As we continue to watch Micron up about 3.6%, in the aftermarket. What's the kind of AI general pull-through that we can say here based on what we got from Micron?
Yeah, basically we need to understand one of the sort of limiting factors in using AI. When we talk about using AI, we're talking about inference. Mm-hmm. And that is the ability of any model to be useful and recall its existing memory. Basically, the design of high bandwidth memory is it's lots of DRAM chips squished on top of each other, usually a stack of 8 or so of them with wires run it through it. And the innovation that Micron, but others like SK Hynix and Samsung was able to achieve is to reduce the latency of information passing from one part of the server design to the other. What I find really interesting is that with micro focus on the current period, right, it's a quite sizable beat against consensus estimates. But the kind of wink that the company's giving in the statement is that they're continuing to invest in capacity. Jake will remember, because we talked about it a lot at the time, that we were trying to do the math when they upsized their commitment to investing in additional US manufacturing capacity. It is slow and it's expensive to do, but I'm looking for signs, and maybe Jake can jump in and tell me where I can find them, if they are what we would call supply constrained. In other words, is the demand out there greater than their ability to supply right now? And is that a limiting factor in high bandwidth memory? Because the rest of the marketplace for data centers would tell you that that is or is not the case. NVIDIA would say that probably is still the case.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's a pretty good point that Ed brings up. One of the things that we're looking at when we look at the quarterly results is how pricing versus bit growth. And pricing was the major driver this quarter. Yes, there's mix in that. Some of that is high bandwidth memory. But really, Micron and the industry are supply constrained, not just in high bandwidth memory, but also in the traditional DRAM and NAND businesses, less so NAND right now in general. And that really is something that we'll have to look at, because the more supply constrained they are, the more ability they can drive pricing.